Okay, so welcome everyone to this new meeting of the seminar series in moral philosophy. And it's really a pleasure to introduce our new speaker, the speaker of today, Dan Lapsley. Dan is a professor of psychology at Notre Dame, at the University of Notre Dame, where he is also the director of the Moral and Adolescent Psychology Lab, which works on a wide range of topics in moral psychology and adolescent development, in particular on notions such as moral person, character, moral education, intellectual virtues, risk behavior in adolescents, and is the author of a wide range of publications on these topics, including a book with Darcia Narvaez on personality, identity, and character. As usual, we give our speakers 40-50 minutes to present their talk, and then we have plenty of time for questions. So Dan, the floor is yours. And yeah, please, thank you.
Yeah, for that introduction. It's really great to be with everybody. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. It's still morning here in the New World, so I hope your Friday is going well and your week is ending well and you're looking forward to the weekend. So I'm told, Michelle told me, and Sophia just said I could speak for 40 minutes or so. I don't know whether I have 40 minutes here, but no one ever gets upset if the speaker stops early. So I remarked to Michelle in an email that I generally dislike titles of talks or papers that are in the form of questions, thinking it a bit too coy. And, why not just tell us the answer in the title after asking the question? I think that's a bit more assertive and muscular, just to tell us the answer. So here I am asking a question: is phronesis a psychological construct? But I'm not going to make you wait for my response. In my opinion, the answer is no. I fear I might be alone on this, although I understand some philosophers are also what might be called phronesis skeptics. Christian Miller, Matt Stichter perhaps might also be skeptics about it. So I might be in good company after all. But I do want to make clear that I am not arguing that phronesis is unimportant or doesn't have a crucial role to play in Aristotelian-inspired virtue ethics. Maybe Christian and Matt feel this way. On Daniel Russell's account, and I'm quoting Daniel Russell here, that virtue ethics cannot survive without a robust commitment to phronesis, because in the absence of phronesis, we cannot establish an appropriate connection between having a virtue and doing what is right, unless every virtue includes phronesis, unquote. I might add that the link between having a virtue and doing what is right is probably closer tied to moral self-identity than phronesis, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Phronesis has been a very popular construct even outside of the friendly confines of virtue ethics, and here are some fields where you'll see a lot of writing on the need for phronesis. For some of the purposes of in the writing in these fields, the invocation of phronesis is a covering term for things thought crucial for professional practice, such as moral perception or deliberation about particulars, or the importance of having an overall conception of the good life, all for which Aristotle is properly credited. Now, there's nothing problematic about this. Of course, I refer to phronesis myself in a paper last year I did in Educational Psychologist, although sometimes there is a deus ex machina quality to the invocation of phronesis in these literatures that beg for more precise psychological specification. And this is where the neo-Aristotelians come in. Neo-Aristotelians are a group of philosophers and psychologists who argue that phronesis just is the psychological construct we've all been looking for. And they have been pushing this idea and publishing in various psychology journals. I'm not so sure about that. And in my remarks today, I would like to try three things. First, I want to review some interpretations of phronesis as discussed in the philosophical literature. And this includes the focus on phronesis as a meta virtue, phronesis in terms of situational perception and insight, phronesis as the eudaimonic blueprint for moral character. And then I want to try to show how these various interpretations map into robust psychological literatures concerning, for examples, metacognitive development, which accounts for phronesis as a meta virtue, or social cognitive personality theories, which accounts for phronesis as a situational perception and insight interpretation. And then moral self-identity, which accounts for phronesis as a blueprint for moral character. And then the third, my third aim today is to conclude with some general observations about phronesis and empirical moral psychology. So that's what I want to try to do this afternoon for you. Okay, so are we ready? Let's begin with interpretations, the philosophical interpretations of phronesis. Okay, so as I'm sure everybody on the call here knows, phronesis is a virtue of practical reasoning. It's an excellence of deliberation that is attached to every character virtue. It orients each virtue towards its characteristic mean, which is to say, to what is fitting or required for the occasion, to engage in feelings or actions at the right times, about the right things, toward the right people, for the right end, and in the right way, as Aristotle famously put it. The work of phronesis is accomplished with a suite of additional, I guess, the practical virtues, including comprehension, sense, intelligence, and cleverness. And these are described in the table I just put up on the screen. And I'm following Daniel Russell's exegesis here. So comprehension is a discriminatory ability to read situations or recognize what is salient or attend properly to advice, for example. Sense is correct discrimination of what is reasonable, judgments about what is decent, requires an ability to sympathetically discern the perspective of others. Intelligence is correctly adjusting one's grasp of what one must do in particular circumstances as regards a general end. And then cleverness, the ability to do the actions that tend to promote whatever goal is assumed and be able to achieve it. Okay. Now Knoll in this 1999 paper offers three additional interpretations of phronesis. The rationality interpretation draws attention to what should be done in particular situations by careful deliberation over a chain of reasoning by an understanding of proper acts. The situational perception interpretation emphasizes the role of phronesis in discerning what is best to do given the particularities of specific contexts. It's a way of seeing that classifies circumstances as a possible occasion for action. But it's not entirely a cognitive matter. We must see through our emotional dispositions. Although cognitions are important, of course, without emotions, we do not fully register the facts. And here I'm quoting Nancy Sherman. So this aspect of phronesis will require a combined cognitive affective specification. Knoll's third interpretation of phronesis draws attention to the way it attaches to moral character. What action phronesis bids one to take in a particular situation is tied to who one is as a person. What you see in the moral landscape depends on who you are. It depends on your moral character. Joseph Dunn describes phronesis on this interpretation as the ordering agency in our lives, which characterizes and expresses the kind of person one is. Indeed, on Dunn's view, phronesis comes into its own only in the situations that draw the self into action. It is not a cognitive capacity that one has at one's disposal, but is rather very closely bound up with the kind of person that one is. Okay. So specification of this third feature of phronesis implies an intimate connection to the self of the agent. Hence, a virtuous action can never be identified as such without reference to the disposition of the agent who performs it. Okay, so most accounts of phronesis then seem to refer to the following elements. Phronesis, first of all, is a way of seeing, a way of classifying situations as requiring this or that virtuous action. Phronesis is a discriminative facility to notice ethically relevant features of situations. There is an emotional resonance to phronetic moral perception. We respond to the facts of the matter through emotional dispositions, although cognition walks closely alongside. Phronesis has implications for the sort of person one is, for moral character. It is the ordering agency of our lives that draws for the agent a eudaimonic blueprint that allows expression of the agent's self. And additionally, phronesis is said to function like a meta-virtue in the sense that it adjudicates the application of virtues when several are summoned. I think these are promising candidates for psychological specification. Taking the last point first, Neo-Aristotelians justly consider phronesis a meta-virtue insofar as it enacts and manages the application of other virtues. Indeed, metacognitive themes abound in various accounts of phronesis. Knowing when and how to exhibit a virtue at the right time, in the right way, towards the right ends, is a metacognitive capacity which has a well-attested psychological literature that is a ready resource for understanding phronesis as a developmental construct. The moral character interpretation of phronesis implicates the self as moral agent. Again, Joseph Dunn makes the case in his words for the non-disposability of the agent's self, so that the self appears in the very activity of phronesis itself. Nancy Sherman notes that what appears to the agent as ultimately good and worth pursuing is a matter of his interests and dispositions. Of course, this has implications for the blueprint aspect of phronesis. A conception of the ends of a good life will help an agent construe the particulars of a situation at the moment of action. But it's also the case that what appears to one as ultimately good and worth pursuing is a matter of his interests and dispositions. And how the end of good living appears to the agent will have to do with how the agent sees the salient features of circumstances. And this brings us to the moral perceptual capacities granted by phronesis. These attach to selves with personalities that develop. This should not be controversial. And I now want to point in the direction of the psychological literatures that have implications for understanding phronesis in terms of metacognition, in terms of moral selfhood and personality, and the blueprint feature of phronesis. Okay, so let's begin with the psychological specification of phronesis, beginning with phronesis as metacognition. The metacognitive aspects of phronesis are implicated in its work as a meta-virtue. In particular, the way it monitors and recruits and applies the requisite virtues at the right time, in the right way, for the right ends. It is not enough for the effective moral agent, as Nancy Sherman puts it, to have the right states of character. In addition, one must have capacities for knowing when and how to exhibit them. The developmental literature on metacognition provides insight on this. It provides insight on knowing when and knowing how. And there's a well-attested psychological literature that stands behind it. Metacognition is a fundamentally important concept to cognitive development, educational psychology, the learning sciences, and its range of applications extended to many domains, including epistemic thinking, intellectual virtues, science education, and many more besides. On standard accounts, metacognition involves metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive control processes. Metacognitive knowledge consists primarily of knowledge or beliefs about what factors or variables act or interact in ways to affect the course and outcome of cognitive enterprises. It can take the form of declarative knowledge, or knowing that, or procedural knowledge, knowing how, and conditional knowledge, knowing when. For example, declarative knowledge includes knowledge of task conditions that influence performance, or how knowledge of how strategies can be used to achieve goals. Procedural knowledge concerns how to execute procedural skills effectively and with what degree of automaticity. Conditional knowledge is knowing when and why to apply cognitive actions. Here is the connection to phronesis. Any individual who functions with a high degree of declarative, procedural, or conditional knowledge for any task is engaging in phronesis insofar as intellectual virtues, or perhaps other virtues, are required. The knowing when and knowing how of phronesis is metacognitive in nature, and metacognitive control processes also have a strong claim on phronesis. Cognitive regulation typically involves skills of planning, for example, setting goals or selecting and sequencing strategies, allocating resources. It involves monitoring, which is the awareness of one's comprehension, whether performance is hitting the mark, and evaluation, an assessment of whether learning or behavioral goals have been achieved. Although metacognition is invariably studied in psychology in the context of learning and memory and expertise and comprehension and similar cognitive achievements, I would argue that phronesis as a meta virtue maps onto the facets of metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive control processes. And there is little reason to think that metacognition should somehow work differently when discerning what virtue requires than what learning or what other cognitive action requires. Phronesis has procedural, declarative, and conditional elements. It involves planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Indeed, the meta-virtue processes attributed to phronesis are isomorphic with the various metacognitive components, or else the work of phronesis cannot be accomplished without them. Okay. The metacognitive framing of phronesis is preferred for two additional reasons. First, phronesis does not have a credible developmental story, and hence falls short of the principle of developmental adequacy, a principle I just made up for the chapter I wrote from Maria Silva. Second, there are very clear suggestions about how phronesis should be inculcated in the education of children and adolescents. Metacognition is preferred on both grounds. There is clear evidence, for example, that metacognition can be trained and taught in schools and is firmly located within developmental periods from early childhood to adulthood. Okay, sorry. All right. So phronesis as metacognition. Let's move to phronesis as moral perception. We have seen how phronesis involves a kind of moral perception that allows agents to notice key features of situations. It is a way of seeing, is it a mode of construal? Sorry, that makes possible discernment of ethically relevant particulars. Events do not come pre-labeled or pre-sorted into conceptually sensible categories, except for the schemas that agents bring to their perception of the socio-moral landscape. Moreover, the language of construal and discernment does not imply a completely cognitive mode of perception without also implicating emotions. As Nancy Sherman put it, often we see not dispassionately, but because and through the emotions. Hence, the psychological specification of this facet of phronesis will have to include cognitive affective mechanisms, and also a way to describe the discriminative facility that comes with the kind of moral perception that it permits. Well, social cognitive theories in personality science provides the meta-theoretical framework to understand this aspect of phronesis. On this view, the accessibility and activation of mental representations, including schemas of self and others, of personal goals, scripts, and expectancies, and other social cognitive constructs, shape the meaning we extract from situations. Moreover, social cognitive theories recognize a reciprocal relationship between cognitive and affective processes. Two social cognitive approaches to personality coherence are of particular interest. Walter Mischel's cognitive affective personality system, which is often just referred to as CAPS, and Daniel Servone's knowledge and appraisal personality architecture, often just called CAPA for obvious reasons, offer powerful conceptualization of cognitive affective appraisal mechanisms as envisioned by Phronesis. So I want to say a couple words about each of these, CAPS and CAPA. The CAPS is a broad meta-theoretical framework that models the complex organization of personality and how its cognitive and affective components dynamically interact both within the personality system and across situations. It accounts for how personality coheres as it navigates across situational complexities. And it describes how to locate the stable behavioral signature that denotes personality coherence. These appear as stable if-then profiles of situation behavior relations across the multiplicity of situations wherein which our lives are enacted. And this depends importantly on how mediating social cognitive units of personality, for example, these cognitive affective schemas, encode features of situations. Social cognitive units of personality and their activation and deactivation underwrite the discriminative facility in noticing key features of our environment. It alerts us to virtue-relevant occasions for action. But these cognitive affective schemas do not simply react and encode the features of situations. Instead, we select and shape the circumstances that make up our day-to-day world, creating stable patterns of personal experience. Indeed, and I'm quoting Mischel, indeed, the personality system anticipates, interprets, rearranges, and changes situations as well as reacts to them. It not only responds to the environment, but also may generate, select, modify, and shape situations in reciprocal transactions. Okay, a word about CAPA, Dan Servone's CAPA. Servone's CAPA account of the architecture of personality is a further specification of the CAPS framework and is complementary to it. In fact, I think Dan Servone was a student of Mischel's. CAPA draws attention to the knowledge and appraisal aspects of social cognition. Knowledge is comprised of enduring mental representations of the social landscape, including representations of self, of persons, and things. Servone's examples include cross-situational knowledge that, for example, one is shy, or I had a happy childhood, or I want to be a better person. Or it refers also to situationally specific knowledge, like I'm a perfectionist about schoolwork, or I usually get nervous when speaking in public. Of course, the examples can be extended easily to representations of morally relevant and virtue salient personal and situational knowledge. Appraisal processes drive relational judgments about the meaning of events as it relates to their concerns, plans, and goals. Appraisal is affectively significant because making judgments about the personal meaning of knowledge information comes with emotion-laden valence. Moreover, knowledge and appraisal mechanisms interact in complex ways. Indeed, the social cognitive literature provides robust evidence of how knowledge structures influence appraisal of events. According to Servone, knowledge constructs influence appraisal both passively and actively. Passively, when accessible constructs are used to categorize a stimulus, and actively through strategic processes that occur when constructs receive conscious attention. Sorbonne goes on to note that pre-existing knowledge influences not only the encoding of features of an encounter, but also which features are noticed. Okay, this is perhaps sufficient to draw implication of CAPS and kappa for the moral perception, interpretation, or function of phronesis. These social cognitive frameworks provide a strong theoretical basis for understanding phronetic perception. It detects particulars, identifies salient features, makes possible discriminative facility in perception of the social landscape, is cognitive affective in operation. Moreover, these perceptual functions are not simply peripheral operations, but are driven by central, top-down cognition of plans, goals, expectations, aims, and evaluative standards, a consideration to which I return below with respect to the blueprint function of phronesis. In one sense, the affinity of phronetic perception with social cognitive personality theory vindicates the psychological realism of at least this aspect of phronesis. Something like what phronesis describes with respect to the cognitive affective discernment of particulars is given full theoretical expression in CAPS and kappa, and in social cognitive research more generally. Hence, social cognitive theories of personality provides real cover for the situational perception and insight interpretation of phronesis. However, the value-added yield of phronesis is slight by comparison, and there would be little interest in treating phronesis itself as a psychological construct, or in exchanging the language of social cognitive theory for that of phronesis, its significant role in ethical theory notwithstanding. Okay, let me just pause here to show you where I am in my remarks, to give you hope that I am coming to the end. I want to begin now thirdly with phronesis as a eudaimonic blueprint and make a case for how moral self-identity can help us understand that. Okay, so there's still the matter of phronesis in the moral self interpretation that draws attention to the centrality of the agent's moral self to the operation of practical reason. As I noted earlier, Joseph Dunn, in his exegesis of Aristotle's phronesis, draws attention to the non-disposability of the agent's self. Phronesis does not float above the self, is not something separate from it. The self appears not within the field that can be surveyed by phronesis, he writes, but in the very activity of phronesis itself. Phronesis is very closely bound up with the kind of person one is. And the kind of person one is draws attention to the characterological basis of phronesis, to its tight connection to personality organization, or to the indissociable relationship between phronesis and the moral self. The moral self is a robust area of research in personality and developmental science. I have written extensively in favor of a theory of moral self-identity that draws upon the social cognitive approach to moral personality, as already noted, a reference to an article you might be interested in. You can, if you're interested in this chapter, you can download it from my website. On this view, the dispositional features of moral character are understood in terms of the accessibility of morally relevant knowledge and appraisal schemes for construing personal and social events. A moral virtuous person on this account is one for whom moral norms or virtues or schemas are chronically accessible, deeply central, and important for self-understanding, something easily primed by contextual cues and readily enacted into moral behavior. Indeed, moral identity is a robust predictor of a wide range of moral behavior and moral emotions. In fact, I am not aware of any other variable that has a stronger empirical record in the moral domain. But what is not observed in this domain is the language of phronesis. Of course, the absence of phronetic language could be held against the philosophical adequacy of the moral identity construct. The neo-Aristotelians do carve out a role for moral identity in their account of phronesis, but on their view, moral identity is relatively inert without an infusion of blueprint guidance provided by phronesis. And on this slide, I am providing a model of the general neo-Aristotelian view of things. They write, phronetic persons possess a general conception of the good life and adjust their moral identity to that blueprint, thus furnishing it with motivational force. In other words, rather than moral identity motivating moral action directly, as it's more commonly understood in the moral identity literature, moral identity just sits there without motivation until prompted by phronesis. Phronesis brings along a blueprint. Phronesis motivates moral behavior from a great height at a meta distance, working through the more proximal offices of moral identity far down below, closer to the behavioral field. Well, that virtues require a blueprint of a good life to inform decisions about concrete cases is a standard of Aristotelian virtue theory. One can agree with this standard without conceding that phronesis, as understood by the neo-Aristotelians, has much to do with it. For one thing, it runs counter to Dunn's view that the self appears in the very activity of phronesis itself and is very closely bound up with the kind of person one is. The kind of person one is just is the moral self. The moral self is not handed a blueprint by phronesis, it constitutes the blueprint. The self's identification of morality just is the blueprint that guides moral perception and guides moral action. There is nothing left for phronesis to do. And here I'll channel Harry Frankfurt and Charles Taylor to say that moral identifications, when we identify with morality, this denotes the importance of what we care about and the horizon of significance that informs where we stand, what we believe, and what is to be done. Hence, on this account, insofar as the exercise of virtue requires a blueprint, moral self-identity provides it. Moral identity commitments carve out what is essential, central, and important to self-understanding in a way that provides the frame or horizon within which I can try to determine from case to case what is good or valuable, or what I endorse or oppose. Quoting Charles Taylor. Okay, so let me sum up and bring these remarks to a close. The various functions or interpretations of phronesis translate in a straightforward way into robust psychological literatures concerning metacognitive development, as the phronesis as a meta virtue, social cognitive personality theory, phronesis as cognitive affective perception and insight, and moral self-identity, phronesis as moral character. Phronesis contains multitudes, and it can work on the empirical side of moral psychology in any event, only if it is translated into well-attested theories and constructs. But if it is absorbed into psychological frameworks in this way, it plays no clear value-added explanatory role. If so, this reminded me of the role that the luminiferous ether theory played at the turn of the 20th century to explain the transmission of light. And I wondered, in a chapter I wrote for Mario and Maria Silvia, if the role of phronesis in psychological theories, or maybe even Aristotelian virtue ethics, is much like the role of ether in physics at the turn of the century, once thought crucial, but now expendable. I have to say, after thinking this over, that maybe that was very impolite of me to say that, or maybe unnecessarily provocative for me to suggest that phronesis is the ether theory of ethics. And the neo-Aristotelians have noticed and taken offense. But what I want to say is that the translation of phronesis into the terms of reference of empirical psychology does keep faith with the naturalizing tendencies sweeping through ethics, but does not diminish the centrality of phronesis in Aristotelian virtue ethics, where it still has important work to do to make sense of the Aristotelian corpus. And treating phronesis as a distinctive psychological variable in its own right, which is a clear agenda of the neo-Aristotelians, will simply be unpersuasive when compared with extant theory and ethics. It would not be clear just what phronesis is supposed to do or what it should explain, in which case the use of the phronetic lexicon becomes optional or superfluous or distracting or a form of special pleading on behalf of Aristotle. So that's my final comments. And again, I'm deeply grateful for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. And I have my email address on the screen. And if you want to visit my lab, the MAP lab, that stands for Moral and Adolescent Psychology Lab, the MAP lab. And there you'll find many things if you're interested in other things that I do. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for this very rich presentation. And now we have time for questions. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat as you wish. Johannes,
you're going to call on people, Sophia?
Yeah,
okay.
I think Johannes is first.
Okay, thank you. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that talk. I was reminded of various, I've worked on philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. I was reminded, I mean, they're kind of more or less obvious analogies to consider. And partly this is just a clarificatory question. I wasn't sure, so you seem to be open to the idea that phronesis might still play a vital role in ethics. It's just not a psychological.
I was just being nice.
I was wondering about the extent to which your own virtues come into play here. Is it, I mean, one might think, well, it can only play a role in ethics if it's real. And what you said, one might say, casts doubt on whether it is real. So how could it possibly be an interesting concept in ethics? So that leads me to wonder about, it all depends on how we think of virtue ethics, whether we think of it as a theory, a philosophical, possibly a psychological theory, or as an articulation of the way we ordinarily think about ourselves and others. I mean, that, for example, is one distinction. And in relation to that, I think various analogies suggest themselves. So, for example, there is debate about the reality of perceptual experience as we ordinarily conceive it. So there is a debate, for example, between John Campbell and Tyler Burge, with John Campbell insisting experience is normally conceived as a relation to objects. So when you see a lemon, then your experience involves the very lemon before you because it's a relation to that thing. Tyler Burge saying, well, that sort of thing has no place in psychological theory. It's a myth. It's ether, basically. And then one response might be, well, perhaps psychological theory has no need for that concept, but common sense psychology jolly well does, because it matters for us for all kinds of reasons that we can see lemons in front of us and not only have sort of hallucination-like states in which a certain lemon, something is represented as a lemon or whatever. And so I was wondering whether a similar move might be in order in the case of phronesis. Never mind if the psychologists can't see the thing, it's still real, as can be seen from the point of view of ordinary ethical thinking. Sorry, that was a long question.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Johannes. When I say that phronesis is still an important issue in virtue ethics, I remember reading the really wonderful book by Daniel Russell on phronesis. It's really psychologists are at a disadvantage. It's very hard to track things in fields that are not your own and you're far from expert in it. So what I know about phronesis is what I read from philosophers, but I don't claim any particular expertise. But what I understood from what Daniel Russell was saying is that if we're to understand Aristotle's ethics, then phronesis, you have to include phronesis. It seems to be important for making sense of what Aristotle was trying to say. So that's one way I say, well, it still does heavy lifting in Aristotelian ethics. I come to think of, by the way, I want to also say that common sense stuff is of interest to psychology too. And I have envisioned the relationship between psychology and philosophy, as Mario will know, and I've been pushing a metaphor. I don't know whether that's caught on yet or not, because it's based on an American poet, Robert Frost. Robert Frost wrote a famous poem called "The Mending Wall," and in that poem is the very classic expression Americans misunderstand all the time. So, good walls make good neighbors. So Americans interpret that as meaning we built a wall to keep the neighbor away, and that's good, but that's not what the poem says. And I envision the teamwork between philosophy and psychology as two neighbors coming together to repair a wall at spring mending time. And so we pass things across the wall one to the other. And so I think we have a lot to learn still from the philosophical analyses of things. Psychologists aren't always well prepared to do that. And now, is phronesis real in some sense? I want to say it is, but it doesn't have my hunch is that if we try to treat phronesis as a psychological construct, we will translate it into our own terms. We will translate it into metacognition and personality theory, because these have empirical consequences. And to the extent it has empirical consequences, it's real. So I'm sure I'm not answering your question, Johannes, but those are the thoughts that I
No, you have been answering it. Thank you so much.
Mario?
Thank you, Dan. So I think, as you said, I agree that philosophy and psychology and ethics and psychology have to work together.
Right.
And I think that they have done recently, I think the best philosophy and the best psychology is to destroy the rationalistic myth that reason and can go without emotions.
Right.
Even if some people have gone too far in saying that it can be only emotions count. I think this is too strong. But still, there is an aspect, I think, in ethics that cannot be entirely covered by psychology, is the normative aspect of morality.
Right.
So what is a value? I don't think this can be explained in psychological terms. So the same notion of virtue refers, partly is of course a psychological feature, but it essentially refers to a normative notion, the particular kind of good that one reaches when it acts virtuously. Now, Maria Silvia and I have thought that way. So how can we address this issue? Sometimes virtues conflict with each other. So if virtue were working by themselves, it would be a chaos. If there was no way of adjudicating each time which one is the best, at least to give an idea how you should act. So we need something as a capacity to assess this conflict. So it seems to us that the phronesis, that this ability to solve this conflict is between virtues has to work. And actually we conceive of the single virtues as particular presentations of one capacity or that. So when I am honest, this is just a way of showing that I am phronetic in that particular field of, dealing with money, for example, and so on. So it seems to us that if you go to the normative level, you need to assess normative conflicts. And then in some sense, it's obvious that psychology cannot account for this kind of capacity entirely, even if you need to have you are absolutely right, a psychological framework in which this is possible for us. But I don't think you can only have a psychological explanation of these dynamics. That's my way of trying to rescue phronesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I agree with much of what you say, Mario. I think that the normative aspect is deeply philosophical, and it's lacking in the psychological treatment of these things. And I think this is where the partnership between psychology and virtue ethics philosophy is. I think the things that I profited from really is the philosophical critique of psychological theories of character, for example. I mean, they are absent. I think the normative perspective that you say, and there are no. So you use the expression normative or conflicts at the normative level, and so maybe phronesis is the language of phronesis is necessary to help us understand that. I need to think more about that. I have been making the claim today and in other places that I think the adjudicating thing of phronesis as a meta virtue, adjudicating other virtues, I think that's handled by the blueprint language of virtue, isn't it? And so if we had to specify, how does one resolve how do we resolve psychologically the normative conflicts, or the conflicts at the normative level? Well, you're going to have some metacognitive component, I think, to translate that into behavior. Yeah, that needs some psychological specification. You need some philosophical language as well, analysis, but it will eventually require psychological work through metacognition. And I do want to hold out that, and again, I guess I'm following Charles Taylor here more than others, that that the horizon of significance will provide sort of a way of adjudicating that conflict. And I want to understand our commitment to the moral self or moral identity as a way of tying into something broader, a broad horizon of things that determines from case to case what I should be doing. So I don't want to absorb all of phronesis that's ununderstood. That would be arrogant, and there may be other ways that it plays a role, but I want to hold out from a psychological side of the world, from the empirical side of moral psychology. I think the constructs that I've proposed carry a lot of, they do some heavy lifting.
Good.
Angelo?
No, yes, thank you. Well, perhaps my question is very close to the question of Mario. First of all, many thanks, because I think I agree very much with your speech and with the authors you quoted also, Taylor, Newman, very many of them. No? But my topic, I am interested in this topic, the topic of the motivation. You speak about motivation, no? Motivation and identity. Identity and you speak about conception of good life, no? In the Phronesis and moral self, number 3, no? So I think, which is the engine is of all this machine, no? Is motivation,
right?
And motivation and the identity and self-identity, like Taylor, no? And conception of good life. Always new determinations of good life, I think, no? You have to you need always new determinations of the good life if you have to work with phronesis. Do you think this what I'm saying is correct? Do you think that there is a strict connection between identity, practical identity, and conception of good life when you use phronesis?
Yeah, thanks. So the idea of motivation in moral self-identity really comes up long-standing. It goes back a couple decades in psychology anyway. It goes back to a well-known problem. The well-known problem is knowing the right thing to do and then doing it are very different things, right? So how do we account for moral behavior? You might reach a moral judgment, but we often don't follow through with our moral judgments into moral behavior. So in developmental psychology, that has been called the judgment action gap, okay? Daniel Russell kind of waves his hand at that in his book when I actually quoted him in my remarks today. He says we need a sense of phronesis, because unless we had phronesis, we wouldn't know how to go from a virtue to behavior. And I smuggled in a comment, I don't know whether you noticed, that I said, well, maybe self-identity, you need self-identity, not phronesis, to go from a virtue to behavior. There's a judgment action gap here. And the solution to the judgment action gap in developmental psychology was this understanding of the moral self. So the idea runs like this, that when the self is constructed, when morality is thought to be essential and central and important to self-understanding, and we are motivated to be self-consistent in action. And so when the very sense of selfhood is premised on morality, then not to do what the moral law requires is to give up or threaten your sense of selfhood. And nobody wants that. You know, no one wants to give up this sense of selfhood too easily. You know, so the motive, so it, in my way of thinking, the moral self-identity does provide a motivational engine, as you put it. And so what I want to say is that the blueprint aspect comes from your determination that you're going to identify with morality. And that provides the blueprint. That provides the motivational force that should guide you what to do from case to case.
Many thanks.
Maria Silvia?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks. It was really illuminating, extremely thought-provoking. But just the main question I have out of many, I'd like to ask you. So, and this is really self-interested because it's related to what Mario and I have recently done on phronesis, and it's just to understand more how our intuitions could fit your suggestions or could benefit from your suggestions. So first of all, I wanted to say that I think the main reason why we first proposed to assign phronesis the main role in virtue ethics was something like your Deus ex machina, your Deus ex machina interpretation of phronesis as something which somehow at some point appeared to adjudicate conflicts among virtues, which sounded quite implausible. So on the one hand, you had an increasing proliferation of virtuous traits. There's a name for a virtue every time a new kind of situation emerges, which was challenged by empirical evidence. And then there, over this big sea of innumerable virtuous traits, there was this judge or Deus ex machina, which somehow intervened like a mother to adjudicate conflicts or something like that. So all these pictures looked quite unrealistic to us, and that was the main reason why we thought work could be done to explore a more realistic picture. But rather than going for, let's say, eliminativism, as Christian Miller would have it, so arguing for the unnecessity of phronesis, we thought that maybe the other direction could be promising. Rather than abolishing phronesis, abolishing the supposed, let's say, reification of virtuous traits. So that was the main idea. And then we thought that if we start thinking of, but this is a proposal that obviously is in need of empirical confirmation or refutation, but that if we think that there is, rather than innumerable virtues that should be trained like skills, one main ethical competence that is the real expertise to be trained, many of these issues could be addressed in a different way. So, for example, this implausible relation between this kind of meta virtue over this innumerable set of traits. So the question is basically, what do you think about the idea of exploring this direction, and whether you think that expertise could be a plausible way to reframing phronesis once you don't have the problem of understanding how phronesis relates to the virtues anymore. So once you abolish, let's say, the two-level structure. And so if you think investigating the plausibility of this intuition could be worthwhile.
Yeah, I do think it's worthwhile. And let me say that I have profited from your writings with Mario. In the chapter I wrote for you, I cite them approvingly. I always thought you were sort of phronesis skeptics too, in a way, or at least the way that at least the way it folds into the unity of virtues view, if I remember your writings on that. Yeah, so I'm rather Lacatosian in how I think science works. And now Lacatose used to say that all research programs are born refuted and die refuted, and they swim within an ocean of anomalies, and we should be lenient with budding research theory. So I do know that the neo-Aristotelians are writing about, I mean, there's an article in this week's issue of the Review of General Psychology that's reinterpreting and reframing phronesis in terms of wisdom. And so they're trying to fold it into a wisdom literature in psychology. And I think that's fine. I think that's fine and promising, you know. So I haven't really read that paper yet, but I do know that there's been a lot of effort to reframe phronesis to make it more psychologically realistic, I suppose is a way of putting it. Yeah, so I think that's a promising. I like the idea of expertise. I don't know whether Darsha spoke about that when she was with you a few weeks ago, but I think expertise would be a promising way of going. There's a lot of problems with moral self-identity, let me say. I think as much as I'm committed to that as a way of understanding the moral personality and a way of understanding the social cognitive aspect of personality and dispositional coherence in the area of morality, as much as I'm a fan of that, I think it has work to do as well. You know, for example, we don't quite know yet. I mean, I think if you understand phronesis as a metacognition, we have ways of teaching metacognition. We haven't really dealt with that very much in the area of education and moral education. You know, and I think moral identity has a dark side. The dark side is if you build the self on issues of morality, then when you do something heinous, you're likely to engage in moral disengagement strategies, which is the dark side, I guess, of morality. And so there's a lot of interesting ways of integrating these literatures, but I think we can't get away from our sense of selfhood in any way that we try to reframe phronesis in ways that you know, connect with these literatures. I think is going to be promising. So,
Thanks,
Arthur.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lapsley, for your lecture. I really found it engaging and interesting. I have just one short comment, and I will use that comment to ask the question. So when you use the term construct, I wondered how to interpret that. I mean, all we do in our cognition is building constructs that we use to figure out what's going on out there. So in a way, it could be a construct, but at the same time, it does not mean that there is only our, let's say, fantasy about reality. It's a kind of trying to guess what reality is. So it could be a construct on the one hand, and we can be realists about virtue or phronesis in this case at the same time. And now my question would be, going a little bit further, I'd like to provoke you to go out of psychology realm and say something on meta-ethical level. Namely, do you think that phronesis is only a mechanism that is used for us to build intelligent constructs about values, norms, moral aspects of our situations? Or you would say that it's a mechanism for identifying moral entities. Well, that's my question. Thank you.
Well, let me address your observation first, and I need to think more about the meta-ethical question, meta-normative question. So I use the way constructs, the way psychologists use it, which is a web of theoretical notions that include measurement aspects, and of course it has to be a sense of realism about that. I agree. It's still calling them constructs. I didn't mean to imply that there wasn't a sense of realism about it. So now I'm gonna like whiff on your second question. I don't know what a good answer is here. I just am not. I think that would require more philosophical expertise on what phronesis involves. What do you think, Juan? I mean, is there one way of answering that would be helpful to my case or not to my case?
Well, of course, I won't give you the answer. I wouldn't give you the answer, but I would say it's tempting to try, at least to try the realistic interpretation. And of course, it depends on your interest, but I'm interested not only in, let's say, meta-ethics, but also in real issues, moral issues. And if I want to form the answer, like, what do you think we should do in such a situation? If I say we should do this or that, I don't mean this is just a kind of a social construct. I mean, I'm using some constructs, but to guess what reality is. So I behave as a realist, giving any kind of answer to moral questions. So of course, by analogy, I wanted to convey the idea that the same we do with phronesis when it's the object of our cognition or our debate.
Arthur, I'm gonna have to think more about that. Thank you for posing it that way.
Juan?
Juan, I think you're muted, Juan.
Thank you. Thank you again, Sophia, for the coordination, and thank you then for your illuminating speech. I found several interesting points for my work. Well, I want to ask you two questions. One is historical, quite simple. The other one is a bit more complex, and I'll try to put it briefly. Well, the first one is, if you, are there any references to Magda Arnold in the Kappa proposal, for example, maybe also in the CAPS proposal, but especially in that of Kappa, because we got to know about Magda Arnold in our research group through a footnote in one of Christian Christensen's books. And we found it very, very much interesting as a person and her thought and the influence of her idea of appraisal. This is a simple question. The more complicated regards, it's more from a psychological point of view. Do you think that goal setting and feedback as abilities can foster the formation of phronesis in people? I mean, because with well-done feedback, you can reframe your goals, your aims, your expectations. You can focus on your work. And I think there are very interesting outcomes on serenity. So knowing what you can do, what you cannot do. There's some sort of well-being, serenity of knowing, well, I know I cannot do this, but I know I can do that. And knowing that helps me to put real goals. And it means also efficiency and many other things. I've been working on that with coaches. So I want to know what you think about it. If it could be a way of improving and fostering phronesis. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. With the historical question, I know of Mary Lou Arnold. I don't know if that's the same Arnold. We're talking about the same person. She's Canadian, or she works in Canada, and she has done some, if we're talking about the same person, she's done some writing.
No, it's Magda Arnold. She died in 2002.
Oh, I don't know her work. I'll have to look at Christian's work. If you can, you have my email. If you can pass that
Okay,
along
of course,
to me, I'd be happy to look into that. Yeah, I know Christensen well. He's not always happy with me, but yeah, I deeply respect his work, and he has an article out in this week's issue of the Review of General Psychology, where he's talking about practical wisdom and phronesis. So I'll give that a read when I hang up here. The second question about goal setting and feedback. I agree with you. I think that is a way of instructing in phronesis. One of my former students his name is David Yeager. David is he's been doing writing on what he calls mindsets, and he has a pretty famous article in a psychological bulletin maybe, where he says if you can frame even boring tasks. The title of the paper is Boring but Important. So if you can frame even mundane, prosaic academic tasks into something that is future oriented, that is like this is going to be important for me. You have to do this. It's boring now, but I got to master it. So reframing things in terms of larger than the self goals. Let's put it that way. Goals that are larger than the self is a way of increasing motivation. And if there's, and it seems to me that if we're going to talk about instructing phronesis or instructing the sort of metacognitive skills required for phronesis, I think that's the sort of thing we have to do a deeper dive into the instructional science literatures that get at mindsets, that get at motivations, how to frame things, how to set goals, what feedback to give. I think all of that is, I think there are instructive lessons in the educational psychology literatures to that extent.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Jakubos. So it says, thanks for the fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you if we can stretch the notion and link it to the idea of an embodiment of values that becomes something like a second nature. In this sense, the body is the center of the morality in the sense that it is able to reflect morally, namely using moral principles as values to guide the behavior, even at the subpersonal level. The body as my body becomes the body of a person with certain moral principles that are partly dependent on strong phylogenetic constraints and partly on more plastic ontogenetically ones. So can we talk about phronesis in a monodimensional way, maybe link exclusively to the rational consideration? Or should we think that there are different degrees of freedom in different processes that prepare the behavior? I don't know if you can see it, maybe it's clearer.
I've been reading along.
Okay, great, thanks.
Forgive me, I'm reading still. Yeah, it's an genuinely interesting question. Regarding the embodiment aspect of this, there was a movement in cognitive psychology that wanted to look at embodied cognition. And it was, there's a lot of research that attempted to show embodied cognition, and to the extent that literature was successful, it would be an easy extension to say, well, maybe there's a moral embodiment as well. And I love the idea of second nature as well. That's one of the advantages of expertise, is that some things become like second nature to us. So things that are more effortful, top-down, deliberative, become more automatic. So there's something about that strikes me as right. On the other hand, I think when you look at the replication crisis in psychology, a lot of the experiments that purported to show embodied cognition have difficulty getting replicated. And so there's now new doubts about whether embodied cognition is a realistic thing or not. So my only hesitation about suggesting that maybe something like embodied morality is a possibility. By the way, I love the embodied cognition literature. It's a disappointment to me it's running into replication issues. But if there is a kind of embodied morality, I'd be all in favor of investigating it, but I don't know what its status is. I don't know what its status would be in empirical psychology given the replication crisis.
Okay, there is another question from Arthur, perhaps. Not sure if it was from before or
No,
it's a new one.
Because there are no other people who haven't asked questions yet, so I just allowed myself to ask a different question.
Your questions are too hard, Arthur.
Well, now well, it will be maybe hard to answer, but not hard to at least to grasp what I mean. When you mentioned that maybe phronesis is something real because it has real consequences, so the question bore in my mind at that moment. So you take a kind of empirical approach. By empirical, I mean maybe not behavioristic, but empirical in some maybe weaker sense. And my thought was that a lot of things that we think about phronesis probably come from our introspection. And maybe that's what makes the difference between philosophers and psychologists. Psychologists restrict themselves to what they can somehow prove, show in experimental situation, while philosophers allow themselves into digging into this introspective analysis, self-analysis, and they take a lot of this into what they claim, especially in ethics, I would say. And do you see it as a kind of problem for you as a psychologist when reading and discussing with philosophers?
No. My bookshelf's grown with philosophical works. I find that I don't have that difficulty. I do think there are naturalizing tendencies that sweep through philosophy and not just in ethics. So I guess I've always thought that in order to philosophize about ethics, I guess I take an Owen Flanagan approach to things, you know, the principle of minimal psychological realism. That was his principle. I think that even within ethics, virtue ethics, if you're going to talk about the mind and talk about cognition, I think at some point, what you philosophize about has to rub up against what is realistically demonstrated about human capacities. And so I think ethical theories have to satisfy some minimal criteria of psychological realism. And you know, now Christian Christensen and his team push back against that. They say, well, your psychological theories have to meet some minimal criteria of philosophical adequacy, and I get that too. And one of the things I do try to emphasize in my writings is that what we're aiming for is philosophically responsible moral psychology and empirical responsible ethical philosophy. So somehow we're going to meet across the mending wall.
But would you agree that we can't do without phenomenological element of what?
I don't disagree with that at all. Not a bit. Don't disagree with that.
Okay, let's thank again. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done. No,
oh, you're done. Okay, so let's thank again Dan for being so generous with the answers as well. And thanks again.
Thank you very much. I love being with you, and I'm looking forward to catching up with you guys in the future as well. So drop me a line if I can be of any help, or I certainly could use your help.
Great.
Next time in person.
So I'll just remind you that our next speaker will be Christian Miller on the 11th of March, same hour, same time, so 5 p.m. Italian time. And thanks again, and see you soon.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Yes. Sophia, 1 second. Don't go. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, and bye-bye to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Happy Super Sunday for the Americans.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Sofia,
Sì,
dicevamo...
sì, arrivo subito. Jacopo, c'è ancora? Secondo.
Jacopo c'è.
Mi sente, professoressa?
Sì, no, la sento. No, le volevo dire solo che non si è più registrato per l'esame. Non
Sì, sì, lo so.
Lo sa? Ah, ok.
Lo so. No, mi sono registrato per l'ultimo appello.
Ah, va bene, ok, a posto. Arrivederci.
Sì. Arrivederci, grazie ancora. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Senti Sofia, pensavamo con Maria Silvia, magari interessa anche Claudia, non so, prima di pubblicare il video tagliando il dibattito?
No, ma non lo tagliamo più il dibattito.
Abbiamo deciso di lasciarlo?
Sì, non l'abbiamo più fatto a un certo punto.
Ok. E Davide e Ilenia, adesso dobbiamo parlare del PRIN, non credo che vi interessi.
Ok, grazie.
È finito il pubblico.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Dunque sì, un'altra cosa per Claudia. Con Sofia abbiamo pensato che forse potremmo chiedere, non so se lo conosci.
C'è Michele Mangini in sala d'attesa.
Ammettilo, ma
Mettiamolo.
non so bene. E
Io vedo 5 persone, c'è anche Ilenia Caruso, che non conosco.
Sì, ma Ilenia Caruso secondo me non c'è.
Ah, non c'è.
La rimuovo.
Rimuoviamola. Michele, è finito il dibattito?
Totalmente virtuale.
Noi tra l'altro con Sofia e Maria Silvia tra 9 minuti ci abbiamo il direttivo della SIPA, tanto per...
Ah, ok.
Però dicevo, per quella cosa di Manchester ci è venuto in mente un'altra persona, Claudia.
Okay.
Andrea non può, magari potrebbe anche scrivere insieme a noi qualcosa. C'è questo nuovo ricercatore a Roma 3 che si chiama Mirko Garasic, che ha scritto già con Andrea, io lo conosco bene, eccetera, e che ha fatto anche cose non distanti dal nudging, poi fa molto bioetica, eccetera. Quindi magari potremmo chiedere a lui. Forse saremmo 4 autori, però tanto ci va uno al massimo. Non credo che sia
sì, non penso che sia un problema. Se lui...
Si fa in tempo? Sì. Com'erano poi le scadenze?
Mi sentite?
Sì.
Ok. No,
Claudia...
la scadenza è il 21 di febbraio. Sarebbe meglio mandare qualche giorno prima, anche poter leggere un secondo, non arrivare proprio all'ultimo.
Certo.
Quindi io direi contiamo di avere una settimana.
Ma cosa serve?
Infatti, sì.
Ecco.
Allora, in realtà non serve granché, non servono, se non ho riguardato tutti gli abstract, ma i titoli dei vari interventi e un abstract generale. Quindi io quello un po' l'ho anche impostato. Se dovesse servire qualcos'altro ve lo dico, ma di per sé se mi date i titoli va più che bene.
Ma sarebbe un titolo a questo punto, giusto? Perché presenterebbe solo lui, quindi un titolo solo.
Sì, un titolo per ogni intervento, naturalmente, che potrebbero essere 3 o 4 interventi. Allora, mi sembra che per Maria Silvia e Michelle ci siano loro, perché ci sarebbe la dottoranda che può venire. Non ricordo male. Mi ricordi il nome, per favore, in questo momento mi sta sfuggendo?
Matilde Liberti, ma ti mandiamo il titolo a breve, ne abbiamo già parlato, ci siamo solo dimenticati di mandartelo da bravi.
Voi sareste 3, Claudia, tu scrivi con Elena, giusto? Elena
esatto, io sono con Elena.
Noi scriviamo in 4, insomma una 60ina di persone per il nostro...
per fare 3 interventi, però va bene.
Di cui dal vivo uno.
Da tutti.
Vabbè, okay. Io penso fino a 4 è un po' tanto nell'ambito filosofico, però secondo me è accettabile, anche perché è abbastanza interdisciplinare questa attività, non è...
Poi è tutto da vedere adesso, dobbiamo chiedere a Mirko, poi io stesso, io e Sofia ne parliamo se è del caso di dirlo anche a Andrea, perché 4 sono un po' tanti, lo facciamo noi, vediamo, mo ci pensiamo.
Ma che tu sappia si può partecipare anche online oppure no, è solo una cosa, solo un evento in presenza?
Mi sembra sia in presenza, è previsto in presenza,
okay.
Al momento poi sai, sono tutte cose che si vanno definendo nel tempo,
sì,
però
sì, certo.
Per il momento
al momento se dice in presenza non è che possiamo dire sì, veniamo però, cioè partecipiamo però online, quindi effettivamente una persona
infatti.
Che ci va, ci sta. Ma dove stai, Claudia? A casa tua?
No, guarda, adesso sono in uno studio. Sono in uno studio medico.
Ho capito. Va bene. D'accordo, allora noi ci vediamo lunedì come gruppo.
Ci vediamo lunedì?
Ci vediamo lunedì?
No, non ci vediamo lunedì, non so lunedì.
Se vuoi, però.
No, dobbiamo stabilire quando facciamo la riunione del PRIN in
sì.
realtà. No, vabbè, non ci vediamo lunedì. No, che cosa dovevamo fare? Io
Forse
non so.
verso fine settimana, direi. Adesso io e Maria Silvia ci stiamo sentendo per fare la prima bozza, quindi magari verso
C'era
fine settimana.
un'altra cosa, qual era? Non mi ricordo più. Boh. Vabbè, devo fare qualche altra riunione il lunedì, non mi ricordo quale ormai.
Diciamo che se per questo fatto di Manchester riusciamo a mettere assieme informazioni, un titolo, eccetera, per me va bene entro una settimana, se si riesce a farlo arrivare entro una settimana, quindi entro giovedì, venerdì prossimo, facciamo ancora in tempo. Poi magari ci aggiorniamo, magari Mario, tu appena hai qualche informazione, anche prima, me la dici, in modo che alla peggio, se riusciamo a essere 4 contributi e uno saltasse, comunque si riesce a fare il simposio. Però io mi auguro che riuscite a essere presenti in qualche modo anche per delega, insomma.
Va bene. E noi domani, Sofia, magari io e te prima delle 11, se ci sei, facciamo una chiacchierata.
Sì, magari non so se riesci già a chiamare Mirko stasera o se è tardi.
No, domani lo devo sentire, però parliamo anche io e te prima per vedere un po' come fare eventualmente.
Sì, va bene, va bene.
Ok, allora.
Claudia, invece volevo dirti che io ho deciso che ti dobbiamo sfruttare un po', perché io questa faccenda di l'expertise come fitta nei vari costrutti che
guarda.
ha menzionato non l'ho capita.
È andata Claudia di fronte a questa domanda, ecco.
L'ho chiamata al medico.
Non mi vedete?
Sì, ora sì.
Adesso
Ok,
sì.
era sparito un attimo perché sono col telefono che sta un po' scaricandosi, insomma. Dimmi Maria Silvia, mi sfrutterai per l'expertise?
Sì, perché io non ho capito la sua risposta e non ho capito se e come si può collocare come una cosa alternativa rispetto ai 3 modi che lui ha detto. E siccome so che tu ne sai, secondo me...
Sto un po' riflettendo. Devo dire la verità, per me l'idea della Phronesis come metacognizione è molto interessante. Comunque, anche se io lo rifrasigerei, non lo so, lo ritradurrei come nei termini della metarazionalità, perché la metacognizione in psicologia si usa molto ed è molto interessante, però nel metarazionale c'è un ruolo della volontà diverso forse rispetto alla metacognizione, dove l'elemento della volontà è legato a questa idea del controllo, che però per noi è molto altro. Però sì, vediamo di andarci più a fondo su questa cosa, volentieri.
Noi stiamo continuando a dirla, ma secondo me è arrivata l'ora di capire come dirla e, no? E come
giustificare. Secondo me c'è un aspetto interessante, è quello della moral perception, cioè che uno discrimina gli aspetti morali delle cose. Siccome gli aspetti morali hanno a che fare con la normatività, non sono riducibili nettamente a categorie causali, normali, eccetera. Quindi è chiaro che c'è un contenuto che non può essere spiegato dalla psicologia.
Ecco, ma io quello che mi chiedevo era, cioè tipo nella nozione di skill, quando leggi anche il libro di Stichter, così, a me sembra che l'aspetto della metacognizione, l'aspetto della percezione, cioè siano integrati in una nozione di una competenza, cioè che non siano per forza 2 visioni rivali. No?
Sì, infatti, questo mi pare anche a me. Competenza morale, cioè potrebbe anche essere che non ci abbia un carattere psicologico specifico, però c'ha un contenuto specifico la competenza morale. Questo è l'aspetto, secondo me. Cioè perché ha a che fare con il dover essere, non con l'essere, per dirla Questa è una competenza morale, cioè la Phronesis ha a che fare con il contenuto, la definisce, non necessariamente la capacità, perché uno può usare cose simili per attività di discriminazione che non hanno a che fare, di comportamento, di azione, che non hanno a che fare con la normatività. Può usare le stesse categorie psicologiche, però quando discrimini, non lo so, a me pare che ci sia una specificità del contenuto.
E poi la mia domanda era, che non gli ho fatto così direttamente, era: ma lui che ha scritto tanto sulla ethical competence non la prende in considerazione come un modo per parlare della Phronesis? Allora la mia domanda è, ma allora, cioè, che strano, no? Cioè,
sì, perché lui parla di
non lo fa perché secondo lui è proprio una scemenza, detta brutta? O...
Secondo me lui tratta competenze in generale e poi la dice, vabbè, la applichiamo all'etica, però così ti perdi tutto il punto fondamentale, perché certo che dopo diventa un concetto psicologico come un altro, come già ci sono. E se non lo differenzi, la differenza sta nel contenuto, mica nella forma, secondo me.
Sì, vabbè.
Beh, sì, d'altra parte quando ti muovi nel mondo dei costrutti fai fatica ad andare molto oltre, perché il costrutto è una forma in fondo.
Cioè, quindi
Ma la competence è un costrutto? Cioè quando loro in quei lavori, lui, Darsh, eccetera, parlano di moral competence, ora non mi ricordo se parlano di expertise o di competence, cioè secondo te per loro non è un costrutto? È una nozione più generale che comprende vari costrutti?
A me sembrerebbe che tutto sommato sia un costrutto.
bisogna rifletterci su sta cosa.
Sì.
Però ci penso un po', però l'impressione è stata più quella mia, però ci devo riflettere ulteriormente.
Sì, ma
Ho un'idea, poi adesso ci liberiamo un po', però magari più avanti facciamo un reading group su questo tema.
Sì,
magari.
perché dobbiamo leggerle queste cose, dobbiamo capire noi dove ci collochiamo prima
Il
di
punto è,
pubblicare.
sì, perché questo definisce anche esattamente cos'è sta Phronesis, quindi visto che è una cosa che ci interessa. Lui ha dato anche un po' di readings, eccetera. Mi sa che noi ci dobbiamo andare dall'altra parte, non vorrei...
Sì.
Va bene.
Allora vi lascio, buon lavoro.
Ciao Claudia.
Ci aggiorniamo nei prossimi giorni. Grazie di tutto.
Ciao.
Grazie, ciao. Allora Mario non ti chiamo, ciao.
Dopo ti chiamo io quando abbiamo finito.
Okay.
Ehi,
Ciao.
Ciao.